Cynics call it cutting the grass. Periodically, Israel wages war with the Gaza Strip to curb cross-border attacks and destroy smugglers' tunnels. So, how did the two sides once again find themselves on the brink of renewing that tiring cycle that's brought 3 wars and at least as many major flare-ups in 12 years? The spark this time appears to have been a botched Israeli raid to kidnap a mid-level militant commander. It came just as indirect talks brokered by Egypt and the UN seemed to be bearing a measure of fruits, with Israel giving the green light to Qatar distributing cash to pay civil servants in a Palestinian territory that's often described as a blockaded pressure cooker. We're going to see if an Egyptian brokered ceasefire can hold, and more broadly, look at the role of sometimes competing outside mediators. Indeed, who more broadly, in the absence of the U.S., can take the initiative and try to help break the cycle of tension and war. Today in the France 24 debate, we're wondering if Israel and Gaza are back from the brink. Joining us from London, Abdel Bari Atwan, editor-in-chief of the newspaper Al Rai Al Youm. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you.
Political scientist Yoav Toker, former correspondent for Israeli television and print. How are you? He's a delegate at the Paris Peace Forum. John Linton, European representative for the Alliance for Middle East Peace. All MEP, is that right?
That's correct.
Okay. And from Jerusalem, France 24 correspondent Iris Mockler. Iris, thanks for being with us.
Pleasure.
The France 24 debate on Facebook and Twitter, hashtag F24debate. Residents on both sides of the border had been bracing themselves for the worst in what's already the most serious escalation since the last Israel-Hamas war in 2014. And before we ask Iris whether a ceasefire is holding, let's look at what's happened these past 48 hours with Selena Sykes.
Palestinians mourn their dead. A 22-year-old killed in an Israeli airstrike after an exchange of deadly fire between Israel and Palestinian militants in Gaza that saw Hamas buildings destroyed and an Israeli bus hit by an anti-tank missile. More than 400 rockets have been fired from Gaza into southern Israel, which Hamas said were revenge for an Israeli operation in Gaza on Sunday, which resulted in the death of 6 Palestinian militants and an Israeli soldier. Israel's Iron Dome missile defences intercepted dozens of these, but some hit civilian areas, including this building in the city of Ashkelon, where a man was killed.
Our intention is to continue to defend. We are not the ones that are aggressing against Gaza. There are Israeli lives at stake, and if we don't engage with the terrorists inside where the terrorists are, whether it is in Gaza or in other locations, then of course that will allow them to do dangerous things against our civilians.
In response, Israeli aircraft hit 150 militant targets in Gaza, including a Hamas TV station and a security office, while more Israeli troops have been sent to the Israel-Gaza border. Since March, violent clashes have accompanied major protests along the border, but these had calmed in recent weeks. Palestinian militant groups announced on Tuesday that they would abide by an Egyptian brokered ceasefire if Israel did the same. According to reports, Israel has suspended its participation in negotiations and said it would continue attacks on Gaza as required after a 6-hour Security Cabinet meeting.
Iris Mockler, is the ceasefire holding?
Apparently so. When I last looked, there were no reports of a breach of the ceasefire. That's from about 5 o'clock, when 5 o'clock local time, when the Palestinian factions first announced that they had signed up to a ceasefire.
When they'd first signed up to a ceasefire, and at this point in time, we were beginning to, grasp just how much one spark can set off this chain of events.
It's interesting, isn't it? I've been thinking about what a ceasefire means, because the two sides are at cross purposes with many things, but it seems that from the Israeli perspective, a ceasefire, even during a ceasefire and ceasefire negotiations, there can be a secret commando raid inside the Gaza Strip. They just think that's acceptable. And from the side of Hamas in Gaza, during a ceasefire, they think they can have tens of thousands of people protesting at the border, a protest that starts peacefully and doesn't always end peacefully, and includes sending kites aflame over the border to destroy Israeli fields. They think that's acceptable, and neither side sees that either of those things really is a breach of a ceasefire.
Neither of the sides see them. Do we know any more about this botched raid?
No, there's been very strict censorship, so strict that we don't even know the name of the lieutenant colonel who died. He's only known by his initial M, and there were no pictures from that funeral of any faces there, and everybody who has spoken about him has had their voices altered. So we don't know. What we are told, what the Israeli politicians tell the public, and what was said in his eulogy is that he will be remembered as a hero of Israel, like Yoni Netanyahu, the brother of the present Prime Minister who led the raid in Entebbe in the 1970s. So there is that feeling that he has done something special. That's what's being conveyed to the Israeli public, but no details whatsoever.
Abdelbari Atwan, again, picking up on something Iris just said, the word ceasefire has a meaning all its own when it comes to Israel and Gaza.
I'm surprised. There is one definition of the ceasefire. Is both sides should be committed fully to the ceasefire. What happened? Hamas actually, for last 6 months, they were fully committed to the ceasefire. They were listening to the Egyptian mediator who would like to broker a deal with between Hamas and the Israeli, and suddenly the Israelis sent a special units to go and commit terrorist acts inside Gaza Strip, to abduct some of Hamas leaders, to kill them. We don't know. So who provoked the attention in this case? It is the Israeli. Hamas was fully committed to the ceasefire, to the truce. But the Israelis don't want truce. They don't want ceasefire. They want to kill the Palestinians because they believe they have the upper hands and they can kill whoever they want to kill, and nobody is actually raising a finger against them. This is the problem. The international community is completely silent. Gaza under a siege for the last 11 years. People are starving. There is no medicine. There is no electricity. Nothing at all. And at the top of that, the Israelis sending their warplanes and bombing the people there. They bombed, a television station. Why they bomb a television station? Why they demolished 9 buildings in Gaza, and they were to do more? So what they expect the Palestinian people to do? To receive them with flowers, to dance in the streets while the Israeli warplanes bombing them there, killing them? This is the problem we are facing in the Middle East. The Israeli, backed by the American, backed by the European government in particular, and they can do whatever they want to do. This is the situation clearly in Gaza. Now we have a ceasefire. Wait, who will actually invoke this ceasefire? Who will penetrate it? Who will destroy it? I think the Israelis, simply because they believe they can do what they want to do in Gaza and other parts of the Middle East.
All right, again, before I turn to Yoav Toker, I just want to remind people of the context. Last Friday, Qatar's ambassador, his name is Mohammed Al-Ahmadi, goes to deliver $15 million to pay civil servants and the needy in Gaza. He goes into Gaza, and for that, and the question is, it seemed as though this was something obviously that had been brokered. He entered through Israel to go into the Gaza Strip. So it looked like there was a measure of détente happening between Israel and Gaza. Why this cross-border raid at this particular time?
Good question. Very good question. And even Israeli public opinion puts that question in a different type of questioning force. And indeed, as your correspondent in Jerusalem or Tel Aviv mentioned, there is very little information as to what were they looking for exactly 48 hours ago. I just remind us all, for the contextualization of this particular operation, is that very early, as it seemed few minutes after the first information was out, the Israeli Israelis took the unusual measure of precising that there was no intention to kill the commander of Hamas who was killed towards the end of this operation.
So what, they wanted to kidnap him?
This is not something Israeli military spokesman would say normally. I mean, they would never comment on whether there was that intention to kill or not their intention to kill. So it was clear that something went wrong. The formula which is used right now by Israeli military spokesmen is that it was a very important operation which had intelligence characteristics. They don't precise what does that mean. The overall appreciation of commentators in the Israeli press is that it was indeed a special operation done by a special commando unit. This explains also why the identity of the fallen officer, Israeli officer, is not published or yet. And something went wrong. Something went wrong. What was it exactly on the terrain which went wrong?
And you heard Abdel Bari's explanation, which is, well, they went in because they could. They felt they have a sense of impunity.
Yes, but that's an explanation on a different level. I mean, I agree with you that Israel actually can do practically whatever it desires to do. And that, of course, it has the upper hand. We know that it's part of the parameters of what is happening in Gaza for such a long time. And it's actually part of the tragedy. The fact that we are not speaking about a conflict in which we have symmetric parameters through which we can say if we put some pressure on A, then B would probably react and A would re-react, etc., etc. Of course, there's a military situation there. I'll just add that this is not the way Israel public opinion is going through all this period, because just over the last 24 hours, for example, there were 50 people injured in southern Israel. Now, you tell me that those bloody statistics are really extremely modest, quote unquote, in relation to the number of casualties and dead persons in Gaza. And you are right. This is an asymmetric combat. But Israeli public opinion putting pressure on its leaders, and we are in a situation in which this security cabinet meeting, which took place this afternoon in Tel Aviv, most ministers had actually to camouflage the way they voted, because they voted not to increase fire. They voted actually, or they insinuated their intention and their preference goes for ceasefire, but they can't tell that publicly because of the overall atmosphere in Israel. Just to illustrate how many traps are there in terms of political positioning. You add to that the fact that in the coming 6 to 8 months, most probably there will be general elections in Israel. That doesn't make things easier on either side. So there's so many elements which just add up to that stalemate.
John Linden, then, what do you do with public opinion whipped up on both sides, and each side thinks they're right? What do you do?
Well, I mean, civil society needs to try and step forward too, and there's a lot of evidence of that happening. And I think leaders need to be given a different incentive structure. Right now, we have it set up so that people on both sides can win political power, or maybe prevent themselves being outflanked.
Because you heard Abdel Bari Atwan asking, why is the international community silent? And why is the international community silent?
I don't think the international community has been silent. I've seen pretty strong statements from a great many European leaders. You can argue what they said, but they certainly addressed what took place. Nikolai Mladenov, the sort of incredibly hardworking UN mediator who's been appointed to the conflict, I know he's been doing shuttle diplomacy, going backwards and forwards. The reality is the international community can put pressure to try and change the parameters on the ground. And I think they should be doing that. There's not enough of it taking place. But they also need to encourage the leaders themselves. And it's not simply Israelis and Palestinians. You have, within the Israeli side, there are sort of ultra hawks within that cabinet who are denying their own position with regards to voting in favour. You even have the opposition, which is quote unquote more moderate than the government, trying to win political points by saying that Netanyahu is not being aggressive enough. And then look at Hamas. So internally within the Gaza Strip, there was a period of quiet between the raid that we spoke about and then the huge escalation the following afternoon. And I think it's probably wise to conclude that Hamas said internally within within Gaza, they had to be seen to be reacting in some way so as to prevent their own outflanking, because as bad as some people may argue Hamas are, there are far worse political actors in the Gaza Strip who are pushing all the time for more extreme outcomes. The challenge we have, and that the international community needs to try and rearrange, is to try and structure things so that more benign actors are rewarded, diplomatically, economically, politically, for taking better actions. If you look at the IDF itself, you know, their
Israeli Defense Forces.
Sorry, the Israeli Defense Forces, they've been agreed now for over 3 years that the policy in Gaza is not helpful. It's not advantageous for Israel's security, putting aside the effects that it has on ordinary Gazans, that it's actually making Israel less secure. The issue is that the political decision makers have created a context where they cannot win political points by making that case. And the same is also true on the Palestinian side. One of the things we've seen over the last few months is the Palestinian Authority actually, sometimes with a wink and a nod, sometimes a little bit more directly, supporting a more aggressive posture inside Gaza as a way of trying to put pressure on Hamas in order for the Fatah and the PLO to achieve some of its policy goals. What's common across all these three different areas is a dehumanization of not just Gazans, but the Israelis that live in those border communities as well, who are suffering because of these sort of violent actions, and who no leaders seem to be taking into account. And I think the opportunity that we have, and if I was advising international politicians on this, is to align yourselves with them. Forget about the political leaders, who are operating quite a capricious way very often, but say we stand with the young people, particularly. The average age in Gaza is 16. Imagine that for a second. I mean, for the last 11 years, the place has been sealed. That's the vast majority of their lived experience. They've lived through 3 wars. Equally, the young people in the south of Israel who suffer inordinately from PTSD, they've had to live through this unbelievable situation where political leaders aren't supporting them. We should get behind those individuals, say that we're aligned with them, their interests are ours.
Abdelbari Atwan, how do you empower those who don't have a voice right now? As we've been hearing from our panel, there's a lot of grandstanding on both sides.
Well, you know, I think the international community should intervene. I'm from Gaza, or I live there, and my family is still there. You know, imagine when 2 million people are besieged. You know, the whole Gaza Strip completely sealed by the Israeli, and they don't have jobs, they don't have water, they don't have electricity. So, what do you expect people to react in this case? Yeah, I think it is the responsibility of the international community to see or to say to the Israeli, enough is enough. You cannot actually continue these atrocities going against besieged people. This is the crux of the matter here.
The crux of the matter. I'm going to have to, Abdelbari, I'm going to have to interrupt you very quickly because we have to take a little break. We'll be right back. Stay with us. You're watching the France 24 debate. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France 24 debate. We're keeping our fingers crossed that a ceasefire will hold between Israel and Gaza after the worst 48 hours of fighting since a war in 2014. We're talking about it with, from London, Abdelbari Atwan, editor-in-chief of Al Rai Al Yom, the newspaper. With us here in the studio, political scientist Yoav Toker, former correspondent for Israeli television and print. John Linden, a delegate at the Paris Peace Forum, the European representative for the Alliance for Middle East Peace, ALMEP, and from Jerusalem, correspondent Iris Mockler. Abdelbari Atwan, I just want to get back to one point here again, which is this buildup to what happened and this deal that was struck. We saw the Qatari ambassador coming in with $15 million. He says he's going to do it every month to pay civil servants in Gaza, going through Israel to come in. So we have an Egyptian mediation, the one for the ceasefire, and a Qatari mediation of some sort, or at least support. Egypt and Qatar, who are rivals, especially when it comes to the standoff between Doha and Saudi Arabia, are they working in tandem or are they having rival diplomacy?
Definitely, it is rival diplomacy. But when we look at the situation in Gaza, the human situation is extremely disastrous. So the people, they haven't been paid for the last 6 months, and people really in the edge of the starvation. So the Qatari maintain good relation with Hamas, and they would like to help them. But it doesn't mean that they are coordinating their efforts with the Egyptian, who is their arch enemy. So both sides, the Qatari working with the Israeli, the Egyptian working also with the Israeli, trying to elevate the human catastrophe in Gaza Strip, which is fine.
But there's also criticism. There's also criticism coming in. For instance, I'm reading a statement that was made to the Reuters news agency by Wasil Abu Youssef, member of the executive committee of the Palestine Liberation Organization. He says arrangements through Qatar and elsewhere prolong the crisis of Palestinian division.
Yes, this is the position of President Abbas, the leader of the Palestinian Authority there in Ramallah. He actually used money in order to put pressure on Hamas to accept his terms of reconciliation. Hamas refused that. They said we need to talk and you should elevate all the pressure against Gaza Strip. So, but it doesn't mean that, the people in Gaza, 2 million in Gaza, should actually continue to be under the siege, deprived from electricity, no salaries at all to their self-servant. So Abbas, I believe, was extremely wrong, and he was completely unpopular among the Palestinians, whether in Gaza or on the West Bank, simply because he put pressure on the weaker side, the side which is actually besieged. So these kind of releases, press releases, or comments from people working for Abbas is actually normal nowadays. It is not the question of separating Gaza from the West Bank. It is the question of actually President Abbas, who's supposed to be a president of all Palestinians, shouldn't treat Gaza Strip and treat 2 million of its inhabitants, its citizens, as actually enemy, and deprive them from all sort of money, deprive them from actually fuel to the only electrical station there. So I think it is a bizarre. But what is happening? What the Egyptians.
So why was there the deal? Why was there this agreement to let in the money this time?
The problem is, Abbas actually would like to twist the arm of Hamas, and he used this money thinking that the Israeli actually will be in his side. But the Israeli did not actually stand in his side, simply because they know that if the Gaza Strip explode, the Israeli will suffer. People, actually millions of people, will break the borders and go to the Israelis, and this will create a huge security problems. They did the same thing before when in Egypt, actually, when Egypt sealed the Rafah border crossing. So I think the Israeli realized that, Abbas actually trying to incite trouble in Gaza Strip, and this will affect their security. But the problem is, why the Israeli are, making this dreadful mistake or dreadful sin, actually, and send these special forces to Gaza in order to destroy the mediation of Egypt and Qatar, and creating a lot of problem and bombing Gaza Strip and killing at least 7 people in their raids. This is the question. Why the Israeli did it in such a critical time?
Yoav Toker, what do you make of, again, we've been talking about the timing, but also you heard Abdel Bari Atwan say that there's these rival diplomacies going on between Qatar and Egypt.
Yeah, and we've seen a lot of examples of that over the last few years, not limited to the Israeli-Palestinian or Israeli-Hamas fronts, so to speak, but also in Syria and also in Yemen. Namely, the enemy of your enemy, contrary to what we were used to think, is not necessarily your friend. And the friend of your friend is not necessarily your friend. So we're into new equations. As to your direct question and to the comments coming from London, no, I honestly do not think that the Israelis per se are looking to heat up the situation. I think honestly that the interest of Israeli government right now, regardless of what the long-range positions and overall political philosophies are of Prime Minister Netanyahu and his coalition members, Israel is not interested in heating up the temperature. Israel is not interested in killing Gazatis, as our colleague in London mentioned earlier. On the contrary, and this actually explains why there are all kind of bizarre, sometimes, combinations in which you find an emissary from Qatar combining his job with someone from Cairo, although normally he wouldn't talk with Cairo, but for that particular purpose, under some kind of discretion, he would do that, and he would travel with, I guess, suitcases or bags or whatever, with $15 million, in cash, just in order to be able to indeed pay government workers in Gaza so they could continue and function.
All right, let me ask Iris Mockler. First of all, does it raise eyebrows, the fact that you have the Qatari ambassador to the Palestinian territories going through Israel to go to Gaza?
Yes, it resolved a problem. I was listening to the other guests, and it is right. Once the decision was made that the Qataris would support, they would pay that money to Gaza, the question was how to get it in. Israel couldn't give that money directly to Hamas. So would Egypt do it? Well, Egypt wasn't going to give Qatari money to Hamas. Would the Palestinian president do it? He wasn't going to give Qatari money to Hamas. So in the end, the Qataris had to give the Qatari money to Hamas in cash in a suitcase. It was the only way that it could be done, and that ambassador had to come through Israel. Now, there's been a mixed reaction in Israel to that. Many people felt uncomfortable at the sight of that, many politicians at any rate, let's start with them, saying that it doesn't look good for Israel and that it's not a wise policy. You can't buy peace, said an opposition leader discussing this after the barrage of rockets came from the Gaza Strip. You can't buy peace, you have to negotiate it. That is also part of the criticism that is coming of Netanyahu at the moment, that this is a stopgap measure to buy him 6 months of quiet, perhaps with an eye on the election that will be held. It's not actually a strategic decision about what to do about the Palestinians in the West Bank and in the Gaza Strip. And there's been some criticism of him, saying that he had a victory of sorts, bloody, difficult, but he had a victory in 2014, and that he squandered that he didn't actually look at what the next steps would be.
Okay.
So those are the criticisms that are being made.
Okay, if the viewer's not confused yet, Iris, it's going to be now, because I'm going to ask you then, why did Netanyahu recently go to see the Sultan of Oman?
Benjamin Netanyahu has a plan that he will make friends in the Arab world, and he's going where the doors are opening. One of those doors is Saudi Arabia, the other is in the Gulf states, or more than one door in the Gulf states. And the Sultan of Oman is a particular kind of character, a very individualistic man, a man who is now not well, and perhaps this is his contribution. Someone I heard a Palestinian friend say he sees himself as the Pope, and that's why he invited the Israeli Prime Minister. So it's part of Benjamin Netanyahu's policy.
But to what end? To do what?
He wants acceptance for Israel. He wants a greater economic... Israel is in the Middle East. It is almost bizarre that it has no dealings with many of its neighbours, and that even the neighbours with whom it has peace deals, it's a very cold peace. It's not a warm peace of any kind. He wants to expand the economy. He wants to have international dealings. He wants to have the sports, an opportunity for Israeli sportsmen to play at sports games. He wants acceptance. That's what he wants.
John Linden.
Yeah, that's what all Israelis crave. And, Benjamin Netanyahu is a very shrewd political actor, and he knows, you could hear from his United Nations speech earlier this year, that making a case that he has broken this new ground in the region, it does definitely help with his poll numbers. But the issue is you cannot separate that normalization of relations with the rest of the Arab world, which I think needs to happen for Israel to be fully accepted in the region, which is the destination we want to get to, from the need to resolve the underlying issues that fuel this conflict. And if you look at Gaza, it's a microcosm of that problem. So you're looking at the short-term gain of a photo op in Oman, rather than examining the long-term toxic trends taking place in Gaza, where the United Nations says it will be unlivable by 2020, where almost all of the water is undrinkable, where there's electricity for half the day if people are lucky. What I would like Prime Minister Netanyahu to do, he's going to become the longest-serving Prime Minister in the history of the State of Israel next year, is to sketch out where he wants to take the Israeli people, and for his Palestinian partners to do the same. I think there's a strange opportunity right now, and some people globally have been arguing for an outside-in strategy for quite a while to bring the leverage the Arab states have, which the Palestinians do not have, and allow that to rebalance a conflict that is, as you have said, very out of kilter. That needs to be done as part of a conflict resolution process. It needs to be done as a quid pro quo. And I think there's an opportunity. I think actually one of the things where the instincts of the Trump administration have been correct have been to look at that angle. Where I would criticize some of the actions have been to try and decouple it from the ongoing occupation and the need for conflict resolution. I think Gaza and the West Bank can't be separated, and neither can the Arab world's relationship with the Palestinian people and the potential key they can play in unlocking this.
Do you realize we're 2/3 of the way through the show, and it's the first time we've mentioned the United States? Normally, if we're doing a show about Israel and the Palestinian territories, that comes up right at the beginning.
And I was about to say, right before you intervened, Francois, that we are 3/4 of the way into the show. We haven't mentioned yet Iran. I don't want to make some of those telespectators who are still with us flee, because it's going to be even more complicated. But indeed, Iran does play a role in all that, directly or indirectly through other protagonists. So it's not only that the enemy of your enemy is not your friend, the friend of your friend is not necessarily your friend. It's also some kind of triangular type of equations, which are indeed very difficult to follow, not only for European publics, but also for the peoples of the region. Coming back to Mr. Netanyahu and the very intelligent distinction here as to what the long-run interest may be for everybody, including himself and his party and his majority in parliament and all that, is that the thesis of Netanyahu, his vision is that due to this situation regarding Iran, with the nuclear dossier, with a very harsh position of, indeed, President Trump and his administration, then a coalition is possible between Israel and the Sunnite nations in the Gulf, Saudi Arabia, Egypt and Jordan, who already have peace treaty with Israel.
But a few years back, that's what it seemed like, right? Because
That's right.
The leadership of Hamas leaving Syria and getting closer when you had, for that short period of time, the Muslim Brotherhood in power in Egypt, it looked as though it was going that way.
I just remind us all that it seemed like that during that very narrow 2-3 year window of Oslo. In the mid-90s, that was exactly the scenario, But that's unfortunately far away and deep in our memories and in our past. One more element which could perhaps spell in so many words is the fact that the division within Palestinian people and Palestinian political authorities is actually mining everybody's efforts, except for those who would like to see the conflict just going on, and perhaps some of those who just are satisfied due to the fact that they do not believe that anything substantial could actually arrive, and therefore managing the conflict, rather managing the conflicts, is the best solution, and this is what Netanyahu actually does, and does it pretty well.
I mean, that's a failure of leadership, whether it's on the Palestinian side or the Israeli side. I mean, fundamentally, this is a conflict that must be resolved. Gaza is a symbol of that. This is completely unsustainable. It's a cliche in this space, but it's so true, and we've seen it this weekend. If you look at, we went from Friday, people expecting an unprecedented breakthrough and some sort of an interim agreement that would transform their lives marginally, but by the standards of Gaza, significantly. And then 3 days later, we have the most destructive period since 2014. That shows you the tinderbox that people are living upon. And I think living day to day, and as a political leader, telling your people, as Benjamin Netanyahu did a couple of years ago, that we must live by the sword forever, that is not a visionary way to lead, and it's not ultimately going to satisfy Israel's underlying security issues.
Israel, which has just celebrated its 70th birthday, however, when Prime Minister Netanyahu was in Paris here this weekend for Centennial commemorations of the end of World War I, it's also served as a reminder that at the end of that conflict in 1918, not only redrew the map of Europe, but also the Middle East, the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, Arab states drawn from scratch on a map, and the rise of the Zionist movement advocating a Jewish state. Abdel Bari Atwan, when you look at those centennial commemorations that have been taking place here in Paris, your thoughts on where the next 100 years can take the Middle East?
Well, Francois, I would like to tell you something personal. I do a lot of television interviews with British television, BBC, ITV, and you remember. I used to avoid, wearing the poppy, which is, the symbol of the First World War, and to commemorate the martyrs or the people who were killed in this. And once I was asked, why you avoid wearing it, I said simply because we were the victim of the First World War. Well, when I say the victim, because, after that, we were promised by the British that we will have our independent empire. And we shouldn't actually stay with the Turkish empire, which is different race, different nationalism. So we should stick to our roots. And we revolted against the Turkish empire. And we fought with the British and the French against the Turkish empire. What happened? We were let down. We actually, our countries were divided. We were put under British or French mandate, and Palestine was given actually to the Jews in order to establish their homeland. So I believe this was the beginning of the problem of instability, and the wars which we are actually going through in the whole of the Middle East. Now, where it will go, I believe now the Americans are putting pressure. The history is repeated itself. The American putting pressure on the Arabs, on the Gulf states in particular, to normalize relation with the Israelis, because Iran is the danger, or the greatest danger, which actually threatening this country or threatening the region. The same thing like the Turkish Empire. Now, those countries in Oman, in Qatar, in United Arab Emirates and others, they are normalizing their relation with the Israeli free of charge. And the Arab peace process, actually, the Arab peace deal is saying clearly that
on the backs of the Palestinians.
Sorry?
On the backs of the
Palestinians. Now, yeah, they are stabbing the Palestinian in the back. To be honest, this is the problem we are facing, and this will create more problems. I believe the coming 100 years will be problematic to the West and to the Israeli at the same time, because they were offered a chance of peace, which is, Oslo Agreement, in order to normalize the relation with the Palestinian, with the Arabs, with everybody. But again, they stab the Palestinian in the back. They deceive them again. No independent Palestinian state as they were promised. The international community turning its back. Now the Palestinian question is a human question, not a political question, not actually a case of a people who lost their hopes to have independent Palestinian state, as the international community promised them to do. 25 years of negotiation, which ended with siege, humiliation, and also to work for the Israeli ambitions to control the whole region. Now Israel is jumping to the Gulf. I believe, look at, if there is a war against Iran, the first people who will suffer, or the greatest loser of this war, will be the Israelis. And we will meet again and we will talk about it.
John Linden.
I mean, look, the First World War parallels are pretty high in everybody's mind at the moment with the Centennial. And as you said, I came from the Paris Peace Forum. I mean, if you look at that moment in history, there was a lot of dynamism. Obviously, it was incredibly negative, and we saw a lot of sort of complex political conflict suddenly evolve into something horrific. In Israel, Palestine, the Middle East generally, we've seen a generation or two of stasis. And what I've noticed in the past sort of 2 to 3 years is dynamism. Now, much of it is bad, but nonetheless, it allows leaders, and I think President Macron is chief amongst them, to work with some of that momentum. It's a dangerous strategy, but the reality for Israelis and Palestinians is that the trajectory that we were on was leading to disastrous outcomes. It was simply happening.
You can't leave it fallow.
No, you can't, but you must take advantage and try and fill the vacuum and use that dynamism to generate positive outcomes. I mean, one of the things we campaign for at ALMEP is an international fund for Israeli-Palestinian peace, built off a fund for Ireland, that can change the outcomes for a generation of Israelis and Palestinians who are growing up hostile to one another. That's a sort of intervention that's necessary. I think bold international leadership is urgent, and if we don't do it, what's going to happen is the very worst actors in both Israel and Palestine, they are poised to take advantage of the political moment at the moment. There's going to be elections coming in Israel. We're probably going to have a leadership transition in Palestine as well. This volatility in this part of the world usually ends up somewhere negative, and too often international actors are standing at one remove, watching it happen and then reacting too late.
Yeah, caught flat-footed. That'll be the final word for now. John Linden, I want to thank you so much. I want to thank Yoav Talker. I want to thank as well Abdel Bari Atwan in London. Iris Mockler in Jerusalem. Stay with us. Media Watch is next. And we say hello to James Creedon, the ceasefire holding for now.
Indeed, just looking, Francois, at reactions to the bombing of Al-Aqsa television station, the Hamas-affiliated TV station. You have various headlines talking about that around the world, but this is just to look first off at the Israeli coverage of it. For them, it's just clearly affiliated with Hamas. It was used for military activities, sending messages to terror operatives, etc. So for the Israeli perspective is that this was a legitimate target. If you go on social media, however, under the hashtag Gaza under attack, you have various images sent by Palestinians, actually tweeting a lot of the time in English, so clearly for an international audience, and they're drawing attention to this. And from their perspective, this is simply the bombing of a press building. And let the world witness this moment, says Mohammed Smiri. You have another comment as well here saying, if Palestinian rockets targeted and destroyed an Israeli television station, Western leaders will be clamouring to be the first to condemn Palestinian aggression against journalism and demand accountability in the name of democracy and freedom of expression. I suppose the question there is, where does the line end between propaganda and neutral journalism? I think everything is quite charged in the Middle East when it comes to news coverage. There is perhaps a bias in most media organisations at some level or another. For years, Hamas terror TV Al-Aqsa has spread propaganda, anti-Semitism and hatred among Gaza residents and children. Tonight, it became a nice future parking lot with minimal damage to nearby residential buildings. So a touch of humour there, despite the fact that it's probably not very funny overall. Yeah. But the Israeli media were quick to point out as well that warning shots were fired and that deaths were minimised as a result. But I believe one journalist at least dead as a result of that. And here again, a kind of a touch of dark humour, the new studios. Lots of comment on it across the board. Some trying to justify the point of view that this really is not a neutral journalism outfit, if you like. This is a CNN video, in fact, that is being linked to this particular tweet as the news of Hamas propaganda station being attacked. Check out what CNN had to say about the station. And they show in this video that you have Hamas fighters going through tunnels and kind of popping out, deadly attacks on Israelis and kind of coming back in. I guess it depends again on your perspective on what is, right. With that kind of content. I suppose you could argue that you have similar content on the other side as well, but no attacks in any case. This is Saverio Leopardi of the Bologna at the Bologna Institute of the University of Bologna Political Studies in Italy, and he is talking about, I suppose, various angles of defence on the Israeli side for these attacks. It's always retaliation, it's always self-defence, even when it's targeted assassination in the middle of a truce negotiation. So clearly some scepticism there about one line of defence. And that was the tweet I just showed you a moment ago. I'll just leave you with this one, sort of beleaguered comment about not Israel, not Palestine, but humanity generally, given the scope and the scale of the attacks. Yeah.
Many thanks for that, James Creedon. I want to thank our panel once again. Thank you for joining us here in the France 24 debate.